Okay, yeah, next slide, please. We'll start with that. So my research is looking at the parliamentary e-petition system of the UK Parliament, and in particular it's looking at a specific inquiry that the Petitions Committee conducted into the online harms experienced by disabled social media users. And a few things motivated me to undertake this study. So firstly, I was interested in parliamentary petitions as a specific form of democratic innovation. They've been adopted by legislatures worldwide. They're signed by tens of thousands of people across various domains. And they've really captured the public imagination, as this case study will show. I think parliamentary petitions are interesting as well, because it's not just about the act of signing the petition, but as previous research has shown, parliamentary petitions can foster important democratic goods, such as political literacy and procedural justice. So the idea that someone's being heard, even if they haven't necessarily got what they wanted. And there is a really rich body of literature that exists already on parliamentary petitions, and there's undoubtedly has valuable insight. But one thing that does characterise this literature is that it tends to examine parliamentary petitions in terms of how they're handled by and affect what you might call the formal sphere of representative institutions. So who participates in them formally, how do petition committees function, what are the policy outputs of e-petitions, and so on. And possibly what we know a little bit less about are the ways in which petitions are shared, deliberated within what we might regard the informal sphere of civil society, and featuring what we might call everyday politics or everyday talk. So those things that aren't necessarily formal political actions, but what we might say are informal actions, where we talk about things on social media or within our families or whatever. Next slide, please. So to sort of inform this research, I've been a bit of a magpie myself and borrowed from a body of literature that was really interesting to get to know. And I've really engaged over the past few months with literature more generally on democratic innovation and other democratic theories. And there's a lot of work out there, in particular on deliberative and participatory democratic innovations. And I sort of didn't fall on one camp or the other, but surveying this literature, I found that there were two key fault lines, two key areas in which people were debating around what participatory preferences individual citizens have and the value of those preferences, and in terms of what participatory venues we should be looking at in terms of understanding where engagement occurs. So in terms of participatory preferences, there's an argument against actually deliberative mechanisms by a great many scholars who say that actually deliberative mechanisms are great, but what you end up with is replicating some of the inequalities that exist in participation. Only a few people can be involved, they place burdens on participants and so on. And at the same time, there's a sort of pushback against an emphasis on always focusing on participation in formal institutional venues. And that's really encapsulated by scholarship and what we might call everyday politics. It says actually what goes on out there in the media, in social media, in terms of everyday talk matters, and it's a viable and vital and worthwhile form of political participation in their own right. So Band's notion of everyday makers, for example, draws attention to the fact that most people nowadays aren't really that interested in that sort of formal participation, that formal continuous relationship with representative institutions. Next slide, please. But I think what this literature did show that actually it's not always necessarily the best thing to focus on individual democratic innovations, because one innovation by itself isn't going to reach out to a wide range of participatory preferences, and actually different innovations are intended to achieve different things, and they might be mutually exclusive or contradictory. And so there's been a call within the literature on democratic theories to ask us to engage in what we might call systems thinking, to think about the interconnections that exist between different types of democratic innovations, or the different democratic processes to which democratic innovations might spin off or give rise to. So thinking about a combination of innovations, both in the formal sphere and in the informal sphere. Next slide, please. And when we start thinking about the formal and informal spheres as well, some democratic theories have directed us towards thinking about what we might call design coupling, or thinking about how you might have formal mechanisms that ensure that that informal sphere, the talk, debate, discussion that goes on those informal spaces, actually has an impact on formal sort of elite deliberative sites such as Parliament. And a lot of theorists said that actually legislative committees are really well positioned to do this because they can bridge the formal and informal spheres, and they're one of the few remaining parts of the parliamentary system that actively facilitates public input, listening, deliberation and public judgment. Next slide, please. So I wanted to see how much of this was relevant in relation to parliamentary petitions. And I had I'm going to draw now on a case study that I've undertaken on the Petitions Committee's inquiry into the online abuse of disabled people, which I took as part of a parliamentary academic fellowship that was hosted by the Petitions Committee. I drew on a range of research tools here, including semi-structured interviews with MPs and officials, qualitative analysis of all documentary evidence associated with this inquiry, and then I also analysed coverage of the petition and the subsequent inquiry in the media and its dissemination on social media. So a bit of an eclectic bag of methods I drew upon. Next slide, please. So we've got this petition into the online abuse of disabled people. This petition was actually started in March 2017 by Katie Price. For those of you who are not in the UK, she's a well-known, slightly divisive media personality, shall we say. I'm not sure she has an official job title, so we'll go with media personality. But she started this petition because she has a teenage son called Harvey, who's biracial and disabled, and he's received a hell of a lot of terrible, terrible racist, ableist abuse on social media. And this petition captured the public imagination. Price promoted it through her own sort of network. She talked about it on TV, and quite quickly it gathered signatures. And the Petitions Committee announced its inquiry into the online abuse of disabled people on the back of that, and subsequently reported in 2019. Now, whilst it was undertaking this inquiry, it found something really interesting, that whenever they interviewed people, expert witnesses such as tech media giants, they were conflating disabled adults with children. So this Petitions Committee would be asking things about how are you protecting your disabled users, and they would talk about safeguarding children quite a lot, and this really upset a lot of people on the committee, these levels of ignorance. So on the back of this, they decided to return to the issue in 2019, and that was given added impetus by the petitions created by another UK media star, Bobby Norris, from the hit television programme The Only Way is Essex. This is quite enjoyable research as well, I have to say, engaging with all these people, very different to what we normally do. And so these two petitions as well got lots of signatures, and the Petitions Committee announced its second inquiry into the issue of online abuse, and that's still underway and a report is anticipated. Next slide, please, Alex. Thank you. So as part of the inquiry, individual citizens had multiple opportunities for formal participation. So there was the usual oral evidence and written evidence giving practices that you would normally have with a select committee. Both the petition creators, for example, were invited to as witnesses before the committee. But more importantly, the committee also had a really detailed public engagement strategy around this committee. It sought to directly involve those with lived experience, so directly engage with members of the disabled community rather than their intermediaries, via face-to-face events that were held across the UK. Now, only small numbers of people participated in these events, but I would argue that a focus of numbers underplays the deliberative affordances of these activities. These activities shaped the inquiry's recommendations, and they were also symbolically important too, making visible a group that had largely to this point been invisible in discussion about online harms. In addition to what we might call these fairly constrained activities, the general public was also able to participate via a range of low intensity and unconstrained actions. Foremost amongst these, obviously, was signing the petition itself, but the wider public could also participate in the inquiry via an online survey and via a comments thread on the House of Commons Facebook page, which received lots of eyeballs and lots of engagements. Next slide, please, Alex. But in addition to what went on within the realm of Parliament itself, so within the realm of formal institutions, I also think it's really important to understand how the petition was disseminated out there in what we might call the informal sphere of civil society, and how the inquiry itself was engaged with. So as I mentioned, both petitions were started by fairly well-known UK media stars. Both of the petitioners sought to use their public profile to leverage support and engagement with the petition. Casey Price made multiple TV appearances on Loose Women, which I also watched, in the interest of research. This is quite fun. I also watched Towie, The Only Way is Essex, where I saw Bobby Norris having a petition party. He pounded the streets of Essex to gather signatures. He also, quite randomly, had a juice detox as part of his preparations for his appearance before the Petitions Committee. I mean, this sounds quite whimsical, it sounds quite out there, but it's not. It's really worth stressing how important this is in terms of everyday politics. Towie, the programme I mentioned, for example, it's one of the most watched programmes amongst 18 to 24-year-olds, and you could see that every time he talked about his inquiry, the levels of engagement on social media with the inquiry, with his wider campaign, went up and up. And in terms of social media as well, both petitioners use the hashtags that are on these slides to publicise the inquiries, publicise the petition, and the audiences that those petitioners were able to reach stands in absolute contrast to what the Petitions Committee or Parliament could reach. Casey Price, for example, has nearly 2 million followers on Instagram. Bobby Norris likewise has 700 followers on Instagram. Whenever Bobby Norris tweeted or put an Instagram post up, tens of thousands of people engaged with his posts, and that compares to maybe 5, 6, 7 who engaged with the posts that the Petitions Committee might put on Twitter. So that informal engagement was happening there on social media, in part because of the profile of the petitioners. Next slide, please. But I think it's important not to say that this was solely a product of what we might call celebrity politics, that also out there in the civil society, that the organisations, individual influencers were also active, also using the Petitions Committee inquiry to perhaps promote their own causes or to draw attention to the issue of ableist abuse and hate crime against disabled people. So Dimensions UK, which is a disability equality charity, for example, piggybacked on the Petitions Committee inquiry by hashtagging I'm with Sam whenever they talked about the Petition Committee inquiry, and that was drawing attention to their own campaign against online hate towards those with autism and learning disabilities. Likewise, we have what we might call individual influencers, such as Dermot Devlin, who's a well-known disability rights blogger who was commenting frequently on the Petitions Committee inquiry, and on the launch of the publication was also interviewed by the BBC and other media channels to offer his sort of expert lived experience opinion on the inquiry. Next slide, please. So we've got all this stuff that happened in Parliament, but we've also got all that stuff that's happening out there in the ground, often on social media or in terms of media coverage and so on. What was really interesting within all of this, though, is thinking about the role of the Petitions Committee in terms of coupling what went on in the informal sphere of civil society with the debates and deliberations that went on within Parliament itself. And because only the Petitions Committee can provide what we might call procedural guarantees of a connection between those two sites. And the Petitions Committee coupled these two sites by using what I've called designing powers and developed practices. So the formal powers that the committee was equipped with gave it significant discretion. It could have chosen any petition to focus its inquiry powers on, or its sort of space in the agenda, as it were. But rather than focusing on those that are most popular or attracting the most signatures, it decided instead to use its powers of discretion to illuminate unseen issues or amplify unheard voices. So in this case, there was a much wider debate going on about online harms, but the specific issue of that abuse experienced by disabled people was largely missing from that conversation. Stemming out of this, the Petitions Committee developed what I might call developed practices in terms of public engagement. It was innovative in terms of the tools that it used to engage the general public, especially those harder to reach groups, as I've indicated on previous slides. And this innovative approach also reflected a willingness on the part of members and officials to step outside their comfort zone and develop new relationships and alternative evidence bases. Now, anyone who's studied select committees know that this diverges from what we might call standard select committee evidence gathering practices in terms of always reaching out to the usual suspects or always doing things a certain way. And it was high risk, but the Petitions Committee members stressed that this was a risk worth taking in terms of giving voice to those people who'd been previously left out of the conversation, and in terms of exerting influence, because that rich testimony is such a powerful, emotive thing when trying to get policy change. Next slide, please. So what did change? As I mentioned, the inquiry was launched at a time when the issue of online harms and hate crime were already on the policy-making agenda. And indeed, today, we're actually expecting the government to publish its online safety bill. And I'll be reading that forensically to see if anything about disabled social media users particularly is mentioned in that. But as with all these things, it's difficult to disentangle the direct policy effects. Several outputs, such as the Online Harms White Paper or the Law Commission consultation into hate crime and online abuse, do give specific consideration to protection of disabled people and cite the work of the Petitions Committee in this space. So we can see that perhaps there's an element of direct policy change there. But I would argue that the indirect effects of this petition and the inquiry also matter. It's not just about policy change, and this is dovetailing with previous scholarship that stressed the procedural justice aspects of petitions. We can see that people engage with the petition in a range of spheres and a variety of ways. The petition and inquiry received widespread coverage. People talked about it. An unseen issue was illuminated and unheard voices were amplified, and those participants were given dignity. Now, the celebrity angle undoubtedly gave the petition and the inquiries a boost, particularly in terms of fostering everyday talk. If you went on Bobby Norris's Instagram, for example, I must confess I ended up being a bit of a fangirl at the end of this research. He's lovely. Bobby's such a nice man. People were talking about their experiences too of the sort of online abuse that they'd experienced, or maybe the homophobic abuse they'd experienced. So there was everyday talk around these issues being fostered in a way that you wouldn't get if you just looked at, for example, who was giving evidence to a parliamentary inquiry. Although it was quite interesting, I also picked up from speaking to members of the Petition Committee that celebrity involvement was a double-edged sword. You don't want the inquiry to be hijacked, my words, by a celebrity, or the celebrity's exposure to overtake the inquiry's exposure. I think the other thing that changed as well is the approach of the Petitions Committee in terms of lived experience and co-production afforded dignity to participants. And as I mentioned, that's symbolically valuable. And also this inquiry, along with other work the Petition Committee has done, has challenged established practices in terms of hierarchies of evidence and the usual suspects. In many respects, the Petition Committee is at the forefront of enhanced public engagement with Parliament. Final slide, please. Thank you. And why does this matter? Well, that was on my slide. I don't know what's happened here. So let me just read out quickly why this matters. So I think this case study matters because I think it shows that there's a wider democratic ecology of parliamentary e-petitions. The participation with e-petitions isn't just about the actors signing a petition or formally taking part in a Petitions Committee inquiry, but by conceptualising this in terms of the wider democratic ecology, I think I've drawn attention to the myriad of participatory preferences and venues. And I think in turn, this demonstrates the importance of systems thinking in terms of our theoretical understanding of democratic participation and innovation, and in terms of our practical understanding of institutional design. I think this case study is also an important reminder that everyday politics is politics. And we need to rethink our assumptions about what constitutes meaningful political engagement or what constitutes meaningful participatory outcomes. A petition's success isn't just about direct policy change, but about providing voice and affording dignity. And more broadly, also about raising awareness, encouraging debate and sharing experiences. But this isn't to say that existing representative institutions don't matter, far from it. Established institutions do matter. Only these institutions can provide that formal procedural connection or guarantee between informal sites of public deliberation and formal sites of elite deliberation. And politics also matters too, and political will matters. Actors must be willing to innovate, champion and listen. And I think the actions of the Petitions Committee provide a really useful roadmap for any parliamentary actor seeking to emulate that.